Would you like to reverse the time? All your abilities will be reset. Please choose the date, February 28, 1985. To the day I was born, I said while grasping the bloodstained and worn-out talisman. Lube-dub. Lube-dub, a consistent rhythm resonated in my world. It sure sounded like my mother's heartbeat, and there must have been amniotic fluid covering my naked body. So when I opened my eyes, the darkness was more comforting than the dark in the dungeons. I was inside my mother's womb. Her heartbeat quickly carried away my memories of the despair I felt that forced me to reverse time and escape to the past. Everything was as I expected. I desperately needed this kind of comfort. Because it was my mother, just listening to her heartbeat made my eyes heavier. It had been a long time since I was tired. The feeling of being drowsy made me feel deep visceral pleasure, and the thought of finally being able to sleep excited me. At least, it was until I became foolishly too excited, then my sleepiness left me. I tried to cover my eyes with my hands in an attempt to fall asleep. However, my tiny arms and legs were out of my control and I inadvertently touched my mother's uterine wall. I heard my mother's muffled voice, and her heartbeat grew louder than her voice. From the lightness of her tone, she probably got too excited and woke my father to tell him that I was kicking. There was a reason why I chose to go back to the date I was born and not the next day or a time after I had grown into an adult. It was because that person had told me about a rare achievement that could be gained. In my opinion, some secrets, such as the process of gaining rare achievements, were more important than anything else in life. Strictly speaking, he didn't actually tell me these things. Instead, I found out what he wanted to keep hidden. He had awakened in his mother's womb. In fact, he is probably the only pre-awakened who retained his entire memories of being a fetus. Overcoming adversity was the character trait he was famous for, and I had unintentionally discovered the accomplishment he had received for that. This achievement had made him the most powerful of the 8 evils and 8 virtues. Most people have experienced the process of overcoming adversity, which was being pushed out of their mother's womb through the birth canal. However, it was the capability to bring that hardship and pain into a reality that decided whether or not a person deserved the title, the man who overcomes adversity. After all, no one remembered what truly happened when they were born. There were some people who claimed to have fetal memories like him, but they couldn't recall the difficult adversity they had to overcome to come out to this world. But he had said that the most painful moment in his entire life was passing through the birth canal, and that if the rest of us remembered what it felt like, we would have no choice but to love ourselves. That was why he was so narcissistic. Although he wasn't good looking. Was it really that painful to pass through the birth canal? I thought something was wrong. I knew it would be painful, but not to that extent. The pressure suffocating me from all directions was beyond my ability to handle. The amniotic fluid that should have protected me was insufficient. Also, my body was so big that it filled up every single space in my mother's womb. As a fragile fetus, I was being crushed in this narrow space under immense pressure. It truly felt like my fat was melting, my muscles were being crushed, and all the bones in my body were shattering. That person hadn't been lying. In the outside world, my soft flesh would normally be injured by the slightest pressure, and it did nothing to protect me here. It was just something else that needed to be compressed into impossible compactness to pass through the birth canal. It was obvious that it would be all over for me if I were to cry in the middle of labor. But even so, I still wanted to open my mouth and scream. As soon as I opened my mouth, a fluid-like substance forced itself to my mouth with immense pressure. If I closed my mouth only a bit later, I would have killed not just myself but also my mother. My mind went blank. All I could think of was the unending pain. I was so desperate to be free from this hell that I would even consider joining the loathsome 8 evils and 8 virtues in this life. I thought I had it bad at the start, but the pain I experienced when my skull was compressed at the end of the canal was beyond my imagination. If this continued for any longer, I thought my skull would be smashed. I might have died as I felt my brain being squeezed out through my nose and eyes. The only way to end this pain was to hang me with the umbilical cord. The exact moment I wanted to give up was the moment I heard my mother crying softly. "Hello, Mother." Looking back, the whole process of being squished through the birth canal probably didn't take more than 30 minutes. However, it felt longer than 30 hours due to the never-ending pain. Was something going wrong with the labor? How can birth be this painful? Did everyone go through this hell just to be born? I couldn't believe humanity was created like this. Despite all my suffering, my mother was the only reason I didn't give up. I knew that she was in immense pain as I could not only hear her moans but I could also feel the walls of the womb trembling. I was not alone in this fight. I was with my mother. Soon, my mother pulled together her strength with tears and the direction of the pressure that was suffocating me suddenly reversed. At my moment of desperation, I contributed my own feeble power as a newborn to the force that pushed me out. As soon as my skull was free from the stress, I let out the scream I had been holding in. I could finally cry. The world instantly became brighter. Thank you, Mother, with all my heart. Wah, wah. You have accomplished overcoming adversity. You have earned the trait the man who overcomes adversity as the achievement bonus for being the first person to accomplish this. This was the cheat characteristic that upgraded a person's power level from level S to SS in an instant. The man who overcomes adversity, trait, effect. The moment you are unable to fight, all of your skills and capability levels are boosted by 1 rank. In addition, you will feel no pain and will be healed slightly until the duration. Additional messages such as duration and cooldown timer appeared across my mother's face. My eyes suddenly opened as I felt like I was falling off a cliff. With blurry eyes, I saw small arms moving arbitrarily. The arms belonged to me, but it didn't feel like they were mine yet. I couldn't control my body yet because it only performed reflex movements, irrelevant to external stimuli. Modern science claimed that this happened due to a newborn's immature brain activity. They were right. My brain must not have been fully grown yet. Nevertheless, modern science would not be able to explain my current thinking ability. That belonged to the realm of religion since the ability came from my true soul. I found it hard to move my eyes toward the 2 people looking down at me. My undeveloped sight only allowed me to see the shadows on their faces, and my hearing was also limited. My mother had given birth to me at home instead of the hospital with help from her sister, who was a nurse, due to her poor financial situation. So, the 2 people staring at me must be my mother and aunt. Even though my vision had not fully matured, the system message on the window appeared clear. Reading it had nothing to do with vision as it probably functioned on the same basis of a fetus's imperfect brain being able to properly think because of the soul. They forced us to read the messages as if they were stuffing them into our brains. I read the message that popped up in front of me. Quest Become Healthy 1 begins. Become Healthy 1, Quest, Mission, drink breast milk 300 times in 1 month. Looking at this, I realized why the first evil stood out as a powerful being from the day of Advent. He had gathered points from his infancy. In other words, he was the chosen one. You have to wrap the baby's arms and legs like this, or he will wake up surprised and flounder, Young-hee said. But my son is crying so much. Are you sure there's nothing wrong with him? He has all his fingers and toes, right? Mihee was worried. You've asked that 3 times now. He just wants food. Congratulations. It's a boy, Young-hee replied. Thanks, sis, Mihee said. Young-hee washed off the placenta from Seonhu, and then let Mihee hug him. Mihee was crying not because of the pain, but out of gratitude for her baby being healthy. She still couldn't believe that she had become a mother and had given birth to a child. Mihee couldn't take her eyes off the baby who was crying for milk. She started breastfeeding him. Her worries of not having enough milk dissipated when she saw Seonhu sucking vigorously at her nipples and gulping down milk. He is such a glutton, Mihee remarked. As soon as I latched on my mother's breast, my mouth moved instinctively. It was an involuntary movement similar to my flailing limbs, and I felt like I was inside a small beast. There was a guy whose major skill was soul transference. When he entered a victim, he would have observed his target like this until he completely swallowed their soul. However, this was my body, and the uncontrollable movement of my lips and limbs were just reflexes. There was no reason for me to fight because I wasn't using soul transference to occupy and then hijack another person's body. I felt the lukewarm liquid going down my throat. It had no taste. But I could feel its presence as it moved down my esophagus and stomach. It resembled the sensation of drinking cold water right after waking up in the morning. Thanks to my aunt swaddling me in a blanket, I could finally focus on drinking the breast milk because my limbs were no longer flailing anymore. My mother carefully supported my neck while gazing at me with love. My stomach slowly continued to fill up. This was bliss, and I was about to cry out of sheer happiness. I was glad that I couldn't burst into tears in this body. My mother would have been astonished to see her son crying after his first meal on her breast. I only removed my mouth from her breast when I could no longer drink anymore, and my lips stopped in reflex once my stomach was full. A message popped up. I really wished these notifications wouldn't cover my mother's face. Become healthy, drink breast milk 1/300. When I started to feel stuffed and annoyed by an odd feeling, my aunt lifted me up and started patting my back. I couldn't throw up what I swallowed. I thought something was stuck inside my stomach, but it was just a burp. Burp. I felt refreshed, and the sound of my mother and aunt laughing was music to my ears. It was time to sleep, at least for my mom, who had just suffered giving birth to me. But the pain all over my body did not let me sleep. The pain from passing through the birth canal did dissipate after drinking my mother's milk. This, however, was much better than that previous pain. It just annoyed me enough from falling back to sleep. To be honest, I didn't want to sleep. My aunt's touch was as gentle as my mother's, and the time I laid in her arms as she supported my back and neck was so endearing and comfortable. Yet, I wanted to be in my mother's arms even though she was a bit awkward. I cried until my aunt handed me over to my mother and did not stop even when my aunt rubbed my back and sang to me. The moment my mother held me, I stopped crying and they all started laughing again. I already felt sorry for my mother because I needed to drink her breast milk at least 10 times a day for a month to complete this mission. I would have to drink about 12 times a day to be safe. This meant I had to cry out in hunger every 2 hours for breast milk. It was clear that my mother had to make a lot of sacrifices in the future for this. She would have many sleepless nights and weekends. I woke up feeling hungry. I must have fallen asleep. Since I had the mind of an adult, I could repress crying from an empty stomach or wet diapers. I wanted my mother to rest today. There were no postnatal care centers in 1985, and mothers stayed by their babies in this period. Moreover, my mother could not ask for anyone else's help since both my grandmothers had passed away and my aunt had to go back to work. I remembered that my mother started having big problems with her hip in her 40s. This was because she could barely take care of herself when I was born because she had to raise me all by herself. The day of Advent was still far ahead. And I had 30 days before the deadline for this quest expired. So, my mother had to rest at least for today since she wouldn't be able to sleep at night from tomorrow. I began to endure the emptiness in my stomach. This reminded me how weak infants were because my hunger was starting to turn into pain. Although it wasn't a huge agony, it felt like someone was poking my stomach. Maybe this was why babies couldn't hold back their hunger. I had fought against the 8 evils and 8 virtues and overcome the adversity of birth canal with my mother. I could not ruin my mother's only day for rest because of this hunger. However, when the time came, my mother let me suck at her breast. And the survival instincts of an infant kicked in. I should not do this. At least not for today. Become healthy 1, drink breast milk 2/300. Become healthy 1, drink breast milk 9/300. Become healthy 1, drink breast milk 10/300. Become healthy 1, drink breast milk 11/300. Despite my efforts, my mother would not be able to sleep on her first day. My father couldn't even help her because he had just begun his work. Also, parenting was solely the mother's responsibility during this time. My mother never took her eyes off me when she was alone in the house with me. She wrapped me up carefully whenever my limbs flailed out of the blanket even though she was drowsy. She tried to help me fall asleep after feeding me and burping me. My mother's daily routine was an endless repeat of feeding me, burping me, then putting me to sleep. When I wanted to help her out, I pretended to be asleep when she wanted me to. The only time she could sleep was when I pretended to sleep for an hour or so. After about a week, I saw my mother crying for the first time. A weary weeping sound came out from her vague silhouette. Her sobs were completely the opposite of the laughter I had heard with my aunt. My mother was facing her limits since she had not slept well even once during the week. I was her first and only child, so it was her first time raising a child. She couldn't go to the bathroom alone, and couldn't sleep enough for a week. That was why she burst into tears, and I realized it had been difficult for my mother to raise me. She stopped crying to feed me, and around that time, I didn't care about the quest anymore. There wasn't going to be a problem with my future plans even if I failed one quest. I didn't mind being hungry for one day if that would let my mother sleep soundly. However, my mother became anxious and called everywhere when I repressed my hunger and didn't cry. 12 times per day, every 2 hours. My mother fed and burped me again as if she had not cried out of despair. My ultimate goal was not too far away or far in the future. It was right in front of me. I placed one word on the top of my list of goals: filial duty. My growth didn't progress as I wished, which made my mother suffer more. She was worried when I first started shaking, and her expression of dread reminded me of when I faced the dungeon. It was just a natural movement from suppressing pain, but she thought it was from epilepsy or seizures. The doctor comforted my mother, saying it was a temporary phenomenon due to my growth spurt, but she couldn't stop fretting about tiny things like all mothers. There was no internet back then, so my mother had to learn how to take care of a baby all by herself. I started to cry on purpose after I realized it made her worry less than when I trembled silently from growing pains. Wah! What-a-ya! I cried. My mother couldn't sleep at all because of me last night and had massaged my limbs until morning. I'll see you later, son. Honey, I'll try to come home early today if possible, my father said. My father went to work early in the morning. I could hardly believe I was seeing him again because I still remember the day I was told my dad had passed away. Then, I realized that my father's voice was more distinct than usual, and I could see objects' outlines very clearly. I had grown up more than yesterday, but my babbling was the same. No matter how hard I tried, I could only say vowels that were easy to pronounce like and o. My son, are you singing? My mother asked. Although I couldn't bring out the status window, I was satisfied with my mother enjoying the moment. My babble was my mother's energy, and she smiled despite the tiredness. I can't believe I gave birth to this cutie pie. Who made you this cute? Coochie coochie coo. My mother didn't kiss my lips or cheeks, but she saw my toes sticking out from the blanket and gave them multiple kisses. Then, she raised her t-shirt naturally and lifted me up. The quest would be completed after this feeding, and my stats have increased in other ways as well. It must be a natural value due to my growth. Normal babies around my age developed that much from their mother's sacrifices, even if they didn't have superpowers. However, points were a different story because it was a unique ability only the awakened could gather. I latched onto my mother's breast. My taste buds were working much better than before, along with my vision and hearing. My mother looked at me with loving eyes as I swallowed her milk that tasted like coconuts. Become healthy one, drink breast milk 300/300. I was full and the survival instinct of moving my mouth would stop when I got a bit older. You have completed the quest, become healthy one, your health has increased by 1, your sense has increased by 1. You have obtained 3 points, total points, 3, the youngest memory I can recall was of a particular day in 1988. I remember watching the Seoul Olympic opening ceremony on television, and, ever since then, I seem to be holding a doll of the Olympic mascot in most of my pictures. My memory of 1988 is that single fragment, which feels like an old dream. Before that date, I had only heard about the life of my parents from 1985 to 1987. My mother and father suffered a lot early in their marriage, and it was true. We lived in a single room, shared a bathroom with the landlord's family, and used their kitchen when they were not using it. One day, my mother worked in the kitchen while carrying me on her back. I knew it was the day when I saw fish cakes on the table. My mother had spoken to me about this day for a long time, that she had to steal a few slices of the owner's fish cakes because she wanted to eat them so badly but didn't have enough money. She said she cried so much when eating them. The reason why my mother still remembered the day was because of how the owner's wife caught her and horribly berated her. Things were happening based on history. My mother glanced out the window and ate an uncooked slice of fish cake. She seemed to have planned to eat only one, but her hand instinctively reached for another. I had to cry as best as I could because even though it seemed trivial, this experience would become a traumatic memory for my mother. Wah! Wah! What-a-ya! I cried. My mother's hand turned toward me and reached for me instead. Baby, okay. Mommy is sorry, my mother said with a teary voice, then rushed out from the kitchen. At that time, my mother ran into the owner's wife, but she was able to pass by without much trouble. This insignificant thing would not change history. And even if it changed, I could live with that for my mother. The news said that the current president, a former military official, visited the US with a formal invitation from their president. My mother was able to relax a little that month as my growing pains had died down noticeably and I stayed calm most of the time. Also, my father brought her his first month's wages. As my mother laid down and breastfed me, I pretended to sleep until she fell asleep. I stopped sucking from her breast when she started snoring, then twisted my body sideways as much as I could. My limbs were still out of my control, but it was possible to toss and turn. I tossed my body and after multiple tries, I finally got space to freely move my lips. People said babies start speaking after about 18 months. However, I had already taken enough rest for the past 50 days and couldn't wait that long. It was more urgent to call on the status window than control my limbs. My goal was to open the bronze box that was given as a bonus item when an awaken called on the status window for the first time. I was extremely certain that the first person who opened the status window would have an incredible benefit, as the title of being the first always has been. Especially, if it was the title of being the first awakened. However, I was only able to babble vowels like and oh. My S pronunciation sounded like wind coming out of a balloon since I didn't have any teeth. One fortunate thing was that the system was generous enough that a perfect accent was not required as long as it was understandable. I started practicing speaking again, next to my sleeping mother. The television my mother turned on was louder than usual. They were focusing on the results of the summit between South Korea and the United States and the agreement that the U.S. would support the direct conversation between South and North Korea. They also highlighted the scene where all these were explained to the three parties' representatives. It was as if the president was a hero who accomplished a great achievement, despite the fact the current government was under a military dictatorship. It was an era in which our economy was continuously growing. The television only broadcasted hopeful news such as the number of registered cars nationwide was over 1 million, or that we had become a country great enough to provide humanitarian aid for our enemy North Korea and poor Ethiopia. The news disclosed the dark side of this period, and I couldn't help but laugh. It was not only because I knew the history but also the state of affairs in Korea or the changes in the world were just the relics of the old times. Humanity was not prepared at all for the day of Advent. I was born and grew up in a time when the Cold War between two ideologies ended, and a new battle arose between human beings under the idea of capitalism. Surprisingly, that was all I saw. My health, strength, agility and sense values had constantly increased, but I still had a long way to go before those were added to my status window. You have received a bronze box as a reward for awakening. I had expected this much, and the next step is the important one. Please pop up. Please, congratulations. You are the first awakener. I knew it. I was so happy that I almost screamed when I saw the sentence. My small heart beat so fast that my entire chest fluttered, but the next sentence chilled my spine. You have received a Challenger box as a reward for being the first awakener. Challenger box. I was aware that the first awakener reward would be amazing. But I didn't expect the Challenger box. It was a challenge for S-classes in the future, and I had only dealt with it once in my life. Time reversal opportunities were given through an astronomical improbability. The time I spent saving points just to open one Challenger box was beyond description. But a 60-day-old baby gets the box? I started to be more scared than happy. Perhaps, I might have twisted the system's structure, or I had been chosen like the 8 evils and the 8 virtues. I was now sure of one thing, the fact that I was now the first in the race.